There are some names that fade quietly into the background of history, and then there are those that refuse to let go, whispering from the past with questions we still can't answer. Elizabeth Wharton's name belongs to the latter. More than a century has passed since her life ended under circumstances that defy simple explanation, yet even now, the details remain shrouded in shadows. What really happened to Elizabeth? Was her death the tragic result of a desperate accident? Or was something far darker at play? And perhaps the most unsettling question of all, why do so many of the people who might have known the truth seem to have left behind only contradictions? Tonight, we step into a story that begins in a seemingly ordinary setting. A young woman going about her life, caught in the ebb and flow of her time. But beneath the surface, threads were tightening, relationships, social pressures, and perhaps secrets that were never meant to see the light of day. It's a story with no neatly tied ending, no clear villain to point to, only a lingering sense that the truth is still out there. Somewhere, buried beneath the years. In this quiet investigation, we'll follow Elizabeth's footsteps, from the person she was, to the day everything changed, to the long, frustrating search for answers. We'll meet the people who surrounded her, study the evidence that has survived, and consider the theories that have tried and failed to fully explain her fate. But this isn't just about facts and timelines. It's about atmosphere, about walking through dimly lit hallways in your mind, hearing echoes of conversations you'll never quite make out. It's about placing yourself in the moment, in the uncertainty, and asking, if you had been there, would you have seen something others missed? Would you have known who to trust? The Elizabeth Wharton case remains one of those unsolved mysteries that seem almost designed to haunt. It's a story with just enough evidence to hint at an answer, and just enough uncertainty to keep that answer forever out of reach. So, settle in. We're about to retrace the final chapters of a life that ended too soon, in a way no one has ever fully understood. This is the chilling and mysterious case of Elizabeth Wharton, a story that still echoes through time. Before Elizabeth Wharton became the subject of whispered speculation and faded newspaper clippings, she was simply Elizabeth. To understand her story, and perhaps to understand what might have happened to her, we have to first step back and see her not as a name in a case file, but as a living, breathing person. Someone with routines, relationships, and the small details that make up a life. Elizabeth was born in the late 19th century, a time when the pace of life moved slower, but societal expectations often felt heavier. She grew up in a modest yet respectable household, surrounded by the quiet hum of daily rituals, morning tea, evening fireside chats, the soft creak of wooden floors that had seen decades of family footsteps. Those who knew her described her as reserved, but not cold, thoughtful, with a habit of listening intently before she spoke. Her appearance, by contemporary accounts, was unassuming yet memorable. Dark eyes that seemed to take in more than they revealed, hair that she wore simply, and a manner of dress that was neither ostentatious nor careless. She had a presence that made people feel at ease, and yet there was something about her, a certain self-containment, that suggested she kept parts of herself tucked away. Elizabeth's days followed a rhythm familiar to many women of her era. She helped with household duties, exchanged letters with friends and family, and was known to take long walks through town, often pausing to greet neighbors or linger in shop windows. But beneath that routine was a spark of quiet independence. She was educated, more so than some might have expected, and had a fondness for reading, often with a preference for novels that carried a thread of mystery. Her social circle was modest but steady. There were family gatherings, friendly teas, and occasional evenings of music or recitation. Among those closest to her, there were whispered acknowledgments of her sharp mind and occasional wit. She could be warm, even playful, in the right company, but only once she felt she truly knew you, there were. 2. Those subtle tensions that can exist in any life. By the time of her final months, Elizabeth was navigating the quiet complexities of relationships, both familial and perhaps romantic. Records and recollections suggest there may have been a man in her life, though accounts vary wildly on who he was and what role, if any, he played in her fate. What we do know is that Elizabeth was not reckless. She carried herself with a kind of measured caution, the kind born from living in a world where a woman's reputation could be fragile, and where every decision seemed to matter more than it should. This makes the events that would soon follow all the more unsettling, because nothing in her known character suggests she was courting danger. Still, there are moments in her life that, when viewed through the lens of hindsight, take on a sharper edge. An argument overheard between Elizabeth and a family member weeks before her death. A letter mentioned in court testimony that has never been found. A sudden change in her walking route, one that put her closer to a particular street, a particular corner, at certain times of day. Were these mere coincidences, or the quiet ripples of something larger moving beneath the surface? Friends would later recall that Elizabeth had seemed preoccupied in the weeks leading up to the tragedy. Not distraught, just elsewhere, as though her mind were turning over something she couldn't easily share. She was still polite, still composed, but there was a slowness to her smiles, a distance in her gaze. Her family, in their own retellings, maintained that nothing was truly amiss, though one wonders how much of that was truth, and how much was the natural urge to protect her memory. After all, in those days, it was common for certain matters to remain behind closed doors, spoken of only in hushed tones. In painting Elizabeth's life, it's important to remember she wasn't a tragic figure in waiting. She was a young woman living an ordinary existence, a life that, had it not been for one fateful turn, might have carried on in quiet anonymity. She might have married, had children, lived out her days in the very same home where she had grown up. Instead, her name would become etched into the fabric of a mystery that refuses to unravel. And so, before we move forward into the details of the incident itself, it's worth pausing here to imagine Elizabeth not as the sum of the events that ended her life, but as she was before them, sitting by a lamplight, pen in hand, writing a letter that might never be read again, walking along a dusty street in the soft light of early evening, looking out of a window, unaware that somewhere in the future, strangers would try to piece together her final days. That's the Elizabeth we should keep in mind as we step into the darker chapters, because without knowing the person she was, we risk losing sight of what was truly lost. It was a cold, slate-gray morning when Elizabeth Wharton awoke for what would unknowingly be the last full day of her life. The frost on the window panes caught the pale winter light, and the small coal fire in her bedroom had burned low overnight. At first glance, there was nothing about the morning of February 14th, 1896, that suggested it would end in tragedy. 7:15 a.m. Elizabeth's day began as it often did, with a quiet breakfast in the kitchen. The maid, a young girl named Clara Jenkins, later testified that Elizabeth had been in good spirits that morning, though she also noted her employer seemed distracted. Clara remembered Elizabeth's tea sitting untouched for several minutes, her gaze fixed on the frost edging the glass. She wasn't sad exactly, Clara recalled during the inquest, but it was as if her mind was walking somewhere else. 8:00 a.m. Not long after breakfast, the household's post arrived. Clara delivered a single envelope to Elizabeth's sitting room. The handwriting on the envelope was unfamiliar to her, and Elizabeth's reaction to it was subtle but unmistakable. She turned the envelope over twice before breaking the seal. Read the contents quickly, and then slipped the letter into the pocket of her dress. No one knows for certain what the letter said. It was never found, but it was the last piece of mail Elizabeth would ever receive. 9:20 a. Elizabeth left the house earlier than usual that morning. She told Clara she intended to visit the grocer and stop by the dressmaker's shop. This was not unusual in itself, but neighbors would later remark that she was dressed more smartly than was typical for errands. Mrs. Henrietta Clark, who lived across the street, saw Elizabeth leave and noted she was wearing her dark green coat, the one she reserved for more formal outings. "I thought she might be meeting someone," Mrs. Clark testified. She looked purposeful. 10:05 a.m. At the small market square, shopkeeper Samuel Boyd claimed to have seen Elizabeth speaking with a man near the fountain. His description was vague: average height, dark overcoat, bowler hat, but he remembered that Elizabeth's tone seemed unusually firm, almost sharp. The exchange lasted less than 2 minutes before the man tipped his hat and walked away. Elizabeth then entered the dressmaker's shop, where she stayed for just 10 minutes, 11:15 a.m. By mid-morning, Elizabeth was back at the house. Clara remembered her being quieter than before, retreating almost immediately to her room. When called for lunch an hour later, she declined, saying she wasn't hungry. 1:30 p.m. This was the moment the day began to feel strange. Elizabeth left the house again, this time without her gloves or her heavier coat, despite the cold. Clara recalled asking if she needed her scarf, but Elizabeth only smiled faintly and said she wouldn't be gone long. She didn't specify where she was going. 2:05 p.m. According to testimony, a local errand boy named Thomas Briggs claimed to have seen Elizabeth walking briskly down Haversham Alley, a narrow passage she rarely used. He noticed she kept glancing over her shoulder, as if she thought she was being followed. Thomas's statement was dismissed by some as unreliable, but it's one of the few moments that offers a glimpse of possible danger on that day. 3:10 p.m. A seamstress named Alice Martin later told investigators she ran into Elizabeth near the old bridge. Elizabeth greeted her politely, but seemed eager to move on. Alice asked if she would be attending the church social that evening, and Elizabeth replied, "I don't believe I'll be there, not tonight." It was said with a tone that Alice found oddly final. 4:00 p.m. From this moment, Elizabeth Wharton seemed to vanish. No confirmed sightings place her anywhere between late afternoon and nightfall. Investigators would later comb through witness statements, but each lead unraveled into uncertainty. Some claimed to have seen her boarding a carriage. Others insisted they saw her near the outskirts of town. The lack of clarity was unsettling. This was not London, where anonymity was easy. This was a town where faces were known. Routines were noticed. 5:45 p.m. Clara Jenkins expected Elizabeth to return before dark, as she often did in winter. But when she stepped outside to bring in the evening post, she noticed something unusual: the faint sound of hurried footsteps echoing down the cobblestones, stopping abruptly. She would later wonder if that sound had belonged to Elizabeth. 7:00 p.m., when the lamps were lit and Elizabeth had still not returned. Clara began to worry. She alerted Elizabeth's brother, who lived nearby. He initially dismissed the concern, suggesting she had stayed with friends. But by 9 p.m., with no word and no sign of her, he walked to the local constable's office to report her missing. In the investigation that followed, certain details from that day became sources of quiet speculation. The missing letter found neither in the house nor among her belongings. The man in the square, never identified. Despite inquiries in nearby towns, the coat and gloves, why leave them behind in the February cold unless she expected to return within minutes? The change in walking routes. She had passed through Haversham Alley, an area she typically avoided. All of it painted a picture that was both frustratingly incomplete and deeply unsettling. In the weeks that followed, newspapers would print Elizabeth's name alongside grainy sketches of her face, and the town would become a place of hushed conversations and wary glances. But on that single day, Before the case became a headline, she was simply a woman moving through her final hours, perhaps aware, or perhaps not, that something was closing in. When word of Elizabeth Wharton's disappearance reached the local police, the initial response was measured, almost cautious. At first, the assumption seemed to be that she had simply gone somewhere on her own, perhaps to clear her head or visit someone without telling her family. People leave, after all. But those who truly knew Elizabeth insisted that this theory was not just unlikely, it was impossible. She was dependable to a fault, the kind of woman who would call ahead if she were running 10 minutes late. The silence was already speaking volumes. The first officers arrived at the Wharton residence within hours of the family's report. Their notes from that day, some of which would later be released to the public, describe a home that looked, at a glance, perfectly ordinary. The kettle on the stove was still warm. A half-finished letter sat on the writing desk in the parlor, and a shawl was draped over the arm of her favorite chair, as though she had only stepped away for a moment. It was this incompleteness of things that unsettled many. Nothing suggested she had been preparing for a trip. Yet nothing screamed crime scene either. We can imagine those early moments. Officers moving quietly through the rooms, glancing at framed photographs, taking in the scent of lavender polish from freshly cleaned floors, and wondering, where could she have gone? And why? Neighbors were interviewed first. One reported seeing Elizabeth in her garden early that morning, tending to her flowers in her wide-brimmed hat. Another claimed she had been walking toward the post office around mid-morning. The times didn't quite align, and some swore they'd seen her again in the afternoon, though none of them could agree on the exact hour. Conflicting witness statements are the bane of any investigation, and in Elizabeth's case, they would only multiply in the days to come. The police then began speaking with family members. Her brother, Thomas, was visibly shaken and could barely get through his statement. He insisted she would never vanish without a word, not to him, not to anyone. A cousin described Elizabeth as too trusting, and mentioned that she'd recently been seen speaking with a man no one recognized. That detail stood out, but frustratingly, no one could describe the man well enough to create a clear sketch. Was it an innocent exchange? Or something more troubling? The ambiguity was maddening. As for physical evidence, there was very little to collect. This was the early 1900s, and forensic science was still in its infancy. There were no DNA swabs or security cameras to fall back on. Investigators looked for footprints, stray fibers, or any signs of forced entry. They found none. The only odd detail was a single glove, Elizabeth's, lying on the ground just inside the back garden gate. It was as though it had been dropped mid-step. Some believed this could have been a sign of a sudden struggle. Others thought it might have been nothing more than an accident. In the absence of clear evidence, the investigation relied heavily on interviews. Friends described Elizabeth's recent moods. Some said she seemed perfectly herself. Others hinted at a quiet restlessness, as though something had been weighing on her mind. A shopkeeper remembered her buying more stationery than usual the week before she vanished, while a church acquaintance thought she'd been distracted during Sunday service. All of these observations painted conflicting portraits. Was Elizabeth content, or was she on the verge of making some private decision? The press soon caught wind of the case, and within days, Elizabeth's name was in the headlines. Newspapers described her disappearance as strange and deeply perplexing, and several stories leaned heavily on the more sensational elements. The mysterious man sighted with her, the solitary glove, the conflicting sightings. This public attention brought in more leads, but also more noise. People began reporting that they had seen her miles away, sometimes even in other towns. Most of these claims proved baseless, but each one had to be checked, consuming valuable time and resources. One particularly strange lead came from a fisherman in a nearby village who who swore he'd seen a woman matching Elizabeth's description boarding a small boat late at night. But when police followed up, a boatman insisted he had ferried no such passenger, and no evidence was found on the shoreline. Was it a case of mistaken identity? Or had the witness seen something he was later persuaded to deny? As weeks passed, frustration began to mount, both within the police department and among the public. Rumors spread quickly. Some believed Elizabeth had been the victim of a random act of violence. Others whispered that she had run off with someone in secret, though this theory didn't hold up under scrutiny. Elizabeth had left behind not just her belongings, but her entire life, her family, her friends, her home. Those who knew her best rejected the idea that she would walk away willingly. The police, for their part, began compiling a short list of possible suspects. None were officially charged, but several people in Elizabeth's circle found themselves under uncomfortable scrutiny. A local tradesman who had recently done repairs at her home was questioned at length. So was an acquaintance with whom she had reportedly argued weeks before her disappearance. These interviews, however, yielded little more than denials and vague recollections. One curious aspect of the investigation was the sheer number of bizarre leads that seemed to pop up at every turn. An anonymous letter arrived at the police station claiming to know where Elizabeth's body could be found, in a disused well outside of town. Officers searched the site thoroughly and found nothing. Another tip suggested she had been taken to a nearby city against her will, but this too led nowhere. Each false lead deepened the sense of mystery and drained resources from the search. Behind the scenes, there were whispers about possible missteps by the authorities. Some locals believed the initial hours after Elizabeth's disappearance had not been used effectively. That crucial evidence might have been overlooked while police still thought she might return on her own. Others criticized the department for focusing too heavily on certain suspects while neglecting to follow up on other potential lines of inquiry. Despite the mounting challenges, investigators continued their work with quiet persistence. The case became something of an obsession for a few of them. In interviews given years later, one retired officer admitted that Elizabeth's disappearance was the one that never left me. He recalled rereading his own notes over and over, looking for some small detail he might have missed. Yet, as days turned into weeks and weeks into months, the trail began to cool. Without new evidence, the investigation stalled. Elizabeth's absence became an ache in the community, a wound that refused to close. And while the police files would eventually be stacked neatly on a shelf and labeled as unsolved, the questions they contained were anything but tidy. Who was the mysterious man seen with her? Why was her glove left behind? And how could someone so loved, so deeply rooted in her life, simply vanish into nothing? These are the questions that still echo, even now, unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. When people in a small community lose someone in such a violent and mysterious way, there's an almost instinctive need to assign blame quickly. It offers a sense of control, the idea that if you can identify the danger, you can avoid it. And for many, in the wake of Elizabeth Wharton's death, the so-called obvious answer presented itself almost immediately. Many believe that the person responsible for Elizabeth's death was someone she knew well, perhaps even someone she trusted. The reasoning was painfully simple. There had been no signs of forced entry, no frantic struggle that spilled out into the streets. Whoever ended her life had likely been invited in, or at the very least, felt confident enough to approach her without arousing suspicion. For investigators, this narrowed the possibilities considerably. The finger of suspicion first turned to a man named Robert Hayes. Robert wasn't a stranger to Elizabeth. In fact, he had been a quiet, constant presence in her life for nearly a year. He was a carpenter who had done some repair work on her home, fixing a loose banister on her staircase and replacing a cracked window pane in her kitchen. According to neighbors, Robert had always seemed polite, but perhaps a little too interested in Elizabeth's personal life. Some said they'd noticed him lingering longer than necessary after jobs were finished, finding reasons to return to her property. Others insisted the two had been seen sharing friendly conversations in the market square, though no one could say for certain if it ever went beyond that. From a police perspective, Robert's name came up for a few key reasons. First, he had the means. As a tradesman, Robert had tools that could be used as weapons. Second, he had opportunity. He knew her schedule, and his work had given him legitimate reasons to be in and around her home. Finally, there was motive, although that part was less clear. Some speculated that Robert might have developed feelings for Elizabeth, and if those feelings weren't returned, perhaps they curdled into resentment. Others wondered if it might have been a financial dispute. Perhaps payment for a job had been delayed, sparking a confrontation. Robert's alibi wasn't airtight. On the day Elizabeth vanished, he claimed to have been working in a neighboring village until early evening, but no one could confirm exactly when he returned home. His employer confirmed he had been on the job site in the morning, but after lunch, Robert had reportedly taken his own vehicle to run an errand. From that point onward, his movements were murky. Still, when investigators questioned him, Robert was calm. He denied any involvement and expressed shock at Elizabeth's death. He even offered to let police search his workshop and home, a gesture that, at least in the public's eyes, seemed either prove his innocence or show his confidence that nothing incriminating would be found. The search yielded nothing. No trace of blood, no belongings of Elizabeth's, no evidence that tied him to the scene. But despite the lack of hard proof, the theory persisted. For those who believed in Robert's guilt, the lack of evidence wasn't exoneration. It was simply a sign of his carefulness. Perhaps he had disposed of incriminating items before the police could find them. Perhaps he had thought ahead in ways investigators couldn't quite piece together. Yet there was something that didn't quite add up. If Robert had been infatuated with Elizabeth or driven by anger, wouldn't someone have noticed signs of tension between them? Friends and neighbors recalled no public arguments, no visible hostility. In fact, Elizabeth herself had spoken warmly of Robert's work, even recommending him to a friend just weeks before her disappearance. This didn't fit the profile of a strained relationship building toward violence. There was also the question of risk. Robert lived in the same small community. If he had harmed Elizabeth, he would have known that suspicion would naturally fall on him. To take such a gamble, especially in a place where everyone knew everyone, seemed almost reckless. Unless he believed he could outwit both the police and the town's watchful eyes. The police eventually released Robert from their immediate focus, citing insufficient evidence. But in the court of public opinion, that didn't matter. Whispers followed him for years, his name spoken in hushed tones at the back of the market, his presence drawing wary glances. In the narrative that took root in the minds of many locals, Robert Hayes was the man who had gotten away with murder. And yet, if Robert wasn't responsible, the obvious answer wasn't so obvious after all. It meant that the person who had harmed Elizabeth might still have been out there, quietly blending in, never once appearing on the police's radar. That unsettling possibility would linger, casting doubt not only on Robert's supposed guilt, but on the safety of the entire town. If the obvious answer failed to hold up under scrutiny, some turned to less conventional possibilities, theories that weren't exactly embraced by everyone, but that also couldn't be dismissed outright. These ideas didn't rely on the straightforward equation of motive, means, and opportunity. Instead, they reached into murkier territory, where facts and speculation begin to blur. One unsettling theory suggested that Elizabeth's death might have been the result of a chance encounter with a stranger, someone entirely outside her normal circle. In small towns, the idea of a random killer passing through feels almost unthinkable, but history has shown it's not impossible. a traveler stopping for the night, a laborer working temporarily in the area, or even someone visiting relatives could have crossed paths with Elizabeth at exactly the wrong moment. The basis for this theory comes from a peculiar detail. In the days before Elizabeth's disappearance, several residents reported seeing an unfamiliar man in the vicinity. He was described as being in his late 30s, wearing a dark overcoat and a hat pulled low. Some thought he might have been a salesman or a railway worker. Others said they'd seen him walking near the path behind Elizabeth's home, seemingly without any clear destination. None of these sightings were tied to any confirmed crime, but the timing was hard to ignore. If this mysterious figure did approach Elizabeth, it's possible the encounter was opportunistic. She was known to be kind, often offering water to delivery boys or stopping to help lost travelers find their way. Could she have offered assistance to someone in need, only for that trust to be betrayed in the worst possible way? But then there's the other side to consider. Random crimes of this nature are, statistically speaking, rare in such a close-knit environment. A stranger would have had to act quickly, escape without drawing attention, and leave behind no useful clues, all in an area where newcomers were easily noticed. If that's what happened, then this wasn't just a crime of opportunity. It was something more deliberate. Another theory takes the unsettling even further. The idea that Elizabeth's death might have been part of something larger, a chain of unsolved cases. Around the same time, in neighboring towns, there were reports of 2 other women who vanished under unusual circumstances. One was later found deceased near a railway embankment. The other was never located. Though the details differed, there were enough parallels: the victims' ages, the lack of forced entry, and the suddenness of their disappearances, to make people wonder if there was a connection. The police never confirmed a link, perhaps wary of sparking panic. But in the quiet spaces between official statements, people talked. Could it be possible that Elizabeth had fallen victim to the same unidentified individual? And if so, had that person simply moved on, leaving a trail of unanswered questions behind? The unsettling nature of this theory lies not only in its scope, but in its implications. If true, it would mean that Elizabeth's killer was never truly part of the town, and therefore never truly within its grasp. Justice, in that case, would be an impossible pursuit. There's also a more intimate, but equally disturbing, variation on the theory, one that suggests the person responsible might have been someone on the very edges of Elizabeth's life, someone she barely knew or had only interacted with once or twice. Perhaps a delivery driver, a visiting tradesman, or even a distant acquaintance from years before. In these scenarios, the danger lies in the unpredictability. There's no long-standing grudge to trace, no clear warning signs. Just a moment when paths crossed and something irreversible happened. What makes these theories unsettling isn't just their unpredictability. It's the fact that they leave so much space for the unknown. In the obvious answer theory, there's at least a framework, a suspect, a set of relationships to examine. Here, the possibilities stretch out endlessly, and every unanswered question becomes another shadow on the wall. It's hard not to wonder about the limits of what we can ever truly know. Could it be possible that the answer lies in one of these fragments? A fleeting sighting, a half-forgotten name, a traveler's brief stop in a town they would never visit again? Or was the truth stranger still, hidden in plain sight, masked by a story no one thought to tell? In the end, these unexplained or unsettling possibilities serve as a reminder that sometimes closure isn't about finding a single neat answer. It's about facing the uncomfortable reality that not every mystery wants to be solved, and that some truths, however chilling, might remain just out of reach. In the early weeks of the investigation, there was an almost tangible sense of urgency. Detectives interviewed anyone who had seen or spoken to Elizabeth in her final days, combed through fields and back roads, and followed up on every whispered rumor that drifted through the town. But as weeks turned into months, the momentum began to fade. Leads dried up, and that once unshakable drive slowly gave way to quiet frustration. Part of the problem was the absence of conclusive evidence. There was no weapon recovered, no definitive witness statement, and no clear sign of struggle that could point to a specific suspect. Even the most promising tips seemed to collapse under scrutiny. A neighbor's recollection would contradict another's. An alleged sighting turned out to be nothing more than a case of mistaken identity. The more the investigation stretched on, the more it began to feel like chasing smoke. The lack of physical evidence was particularly damning. In an era long before forensic science could pull DNA from the smallest trace, detectives had to rely almost entirely on what could be seen, heard, and remembered. And memories, as they well knew, can be fragile things. Without concrete proof, the case became a matter of competing narratives, each with its own gaps and inconsistencies. Public sentiment shifted in noticeable ways. In the beginning, townspeople gathered in groups, swapping theories and offering any scrap of information they thought might help. But as time passed without answers, that openness began to shrink. Conversations grew quieter, glances more guarded. It wasn't that people stopped caring, far from it, but in a small community, speculation can quickly turn into suspicion, and suspicion into division. For some, the lack of progress was almost as painful as the loss itself. Elizabeth's family felt this toll most sharply. In the first year, they were a constant presence at the police station, pressing for updates, offering new ideas, refusing to let the case fade from memory. But over time, each visit seemed to yield the same answer: nothing new. Friends spoke of how the family's home grew quieter, the once lively gatherings replaced with subdued evenings and an undercurrent of exhaustion. It's one thing to grieve a loss. It's another to live in the limbo of not knowing. There were moments, brief, flickering moments, when it seemed like the trail might warm again. An anonymous letter arrived at the police station, claiming to hold the key to Elizabeth's death. The handwriting was uneven, almost hurried, and the contents were maddeningly vague. References to a meeting gone wrong and someone everyone trusts. Investigators tried to trace its origin, but the postmark was smeared, and no one ever came forward to claim responsibility. Then there were the late-night calls to the Wharton family's home. Sometimes there was nothing but silence on the other end. Other times, the faint sound of breathing before the line went dead. Whether these were cruel pranks or something more sinister was never determined, but they left an unsettling mark on those who received them. Years turned into decades. The case file, once thick with daily reports and handwritten notes, began to gather dust. New investigators would sometimes pick it up, flipping through the pages in search of a missed clue, but the trail always led back to the same dead ends. The passage of time erased opportunities. Witnesses aged or passed away, memories faded, and potential evidence that might have been preserved in another era was long gone. And yet, the mystery refused to disappear entirely. Every so often, a local newspaper would run a retrospective, or a true crime enthusiast would dig into the story, hoping to uncover something overlooked. On rare occasions, a tip would come in, a claim of overheard conversations, a suspicious sighting from years before. Most led nowhere, but each one stirred the embers just enough to remind everyone that the case wasn't truly closed. Even now, there are pieces of the puzzle that don't quite fit. Why did certain witnesses give inconsistent statements? Why was that anonymous letter so specific in some ways, yet so deliberately vague in others? And perhaps the most haunting question of all, was the person responsible ever confronted, or have they walked freely through the world, carrying their secret in silence? The coldness of the trail is what makes the story linger. It leaves space for possibility, for hope, for dread, for endless speculation. In Elizabeth's case, it's not just the absence of answers that chills, but the feeling that those answers might still be out there, hidden just beyond reach, waiting for the right eyes to see them. Thank you for joining me in revisiting the haunting mystery of Elizabeth Wharton, a story that still lingers in the quiet corners of history. Cases like this remind us that even when the trail goes cold, the questions never truly fade. Have you heard of this case before? Or perhaps you've come across a detail we didn't touch on tonight. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you find yourself drawn to quiet, haunting investigations and the forgotten stories that history tries to leave behind, consider subscribing. Together, we can continue to uncover these mysteries, one case at a time. Until next time, stay safe and keep your curiosity alive.